This is Nick from Under the Big Tree, and I have a really special treat here. I'm at Knobcon 2022, and I was delighted to run into somebody whose channel I'm a huge fan of and who I've learned a tremendous amount from, particularly as far as synth DIY stuff. Quincas Moreira, otherwise known as Synth DIY Guy.
I have to say the same about your channel. We've been a fan for a while. I really like the quality of the content and the presentation and all of that.
Thank you.
So it's nice to have met you as well. We met in the elevator, actually, and he knew who I was from my voice, not from my face.
It was so funny. You know, I hear that all the time. People are always, you know, I start saying something, and because I have this, you know, this bass voice, people immediately turn around. And it was exactly the same thing. You know, the adjective that I used is, oh my gosh, I know that gentle voice.
Gentle, right?
It's a gentle, but it's a beautiful sound.
I try to make my videos meditative, because if you don't get any information or don't understand anything, at least you get to relax.
Well, and you know, it's a funny thing. So, all right, so to elaborate, we thought it would be a lovely idea to just sit down and have a conversation about synth DIY and all of these issues that we love so much in the realm of modular synthesis and so forth. So I thought it would be a lot of fun for us to sit and talk. And so to start off, I agree with you. What I was going to say is when I'm doing DIY and when I'm actually sitting down at the bench, it feels like a very Zen, meditative kind of task for me.
Yeah, it's something that really draws your attention in and puts you in the moment. And that's what meditation really is anyway. So.
That's a really interesting thought. And of course, you know, as you know, just like as in Zen meditation, you're very focused and concentrating on what it is that you're doing, whether it's concentrating on counting your breaths or listening to your breath, or in this case, you know, if you pick a resistor and you're not paying attention and it's the wrong value, that's going to go badly for you later on down the road.
It's funny you mentioned breath, because even that in my method of DIY comes to play, because I don't want those fumes to go into my face.
Indeed.
So I'm working on a flow of breath that blows the fumes away from me. And so there's even that breath awareness involved.
That's fascinating.
Yeah.
Do you have a little fan to try to blow it away?
I do, but I don't like using fan for some reason. I think I got used to this breathing exercise where I'm gently blowing, because it has to be gentle enough where you don't cool the tip of the iron. So there's like a careful balance, and it's just beautiful. It makes the experience even more meditative than it already is. A few times where I've like thought that I'd be, you know, happier being distracted by some podcast or something, it always ends up being like I can actually zone it out. I don't pay attention to it.
Yeah.
You know, it becomes background noise, so I just stopped using any, you know, trying to see a series while I'm building or anything like that. It's just silence. It's an opportunity in our busy lives to have a few minutes or hours of actual silence and concentration on a task that is enjoyable and yields a very pleasant result that you can then meditate again by making music with.
The way that I like to think about it sometimes is doing synth DIY stuff is like doing a paint-by-numbers painting, right? Because you're following this prescribed path if you're stuffing a circuit board.
You're not necessarily even learning how that is happening, you know, unless you make a mistake, then you have to.
Then you get to learn how to debug. But the result at the end is you don't get an ugly painting to put on the wall. You get another module to put in your case.
You get a musical instrument that you can then use to make music. That's why I consider it like a double gratification process. You have the gratification of enjoying the process of building, and then the extra gratification of making music with that device. And there's a third cherry on top, which is you're making music with something that you yourself built.
There is so much more investment as a result of that, rather than going and, you know, buying something. And of course we have to, you know, and we do, and it's very nice to buy other people's work too. But I agree, there is something so personal when you take something all the way down the road from actually building it to using it to be able to make music that you're then releasing to other people.
Yeah, and there's an additional advantage, which is if you build it, you can probably fix it if it gets damaged at some point. So it adds to your independence in your studio. You're no longer like worried about sending something off to service or whatever. You can just fix it yourself because you've built it. If you've built it, you can fix it.
Absolutely. I have a sad story. I have a Oberheim Matrix 12 that was one of my favorite keyboards ever. And about 3 or 4 years ago, you know, it's a digital computer-based thing. About 3 or 4 years ago, it had some errors and stopped working. I tried to fix it for a year and of course got nowhere with it, and it's been sitting in a repair shop for 2 years and no idea if it'll ever come back to life.
Right.
But that's the difference between, you know,
Yeah.
something old like that and something that you can build
Exactly.
yourself.
If you can just, that's the spirit of DIY. If you can take something and actually do it yourself, it's just so much hassle that you know you have having to depend on somebody else's time and to like. I had at some point somebody lent me an Elise's drum machine.
The HR-16.
That one.
Yeah.
And for some reason the pads weren't really working. They weren't triggering. And this was before I even got into DIY, but I always had the spirit. That's why I eventually ended up DIYing stuff, was because I already had this predisposition to want to do things by myself. And what I did is I just opened it up to see, and I realized that all of the contacts were oxidized. So I happened to have a soldering iron that I had used to make some cables at some point. And I just reflowed the solder on those contact points, and suddenly they became shiny again. And I put it back together, and the buttons were working.
Lo and behold.
That was one of my first glimpses and insights into the possibility of actually doing things myself. And I felt very, accomplished that
Empowered,
empowered that I, instead of having to go find somebody who knows how to fix an HR-16, I just opened it up, and in this case it happened to be a very simple fix, but it did plant the seed in me that, wow, there's something to the attitude of let's tinker, open something up, find out how it works, and maybe we can do something about it ourselves. There's also the recognition sometimes that you can't, understanding your limitation. Like when I found a synth cushion on a thrift shop in Mexico City for $40, and these things in working condition were selling for $3,000 on eBay.
Oh my goodness.
And I didn't even know it when I saw it. I just saw it. I recognized
that
that it
looks
was
cool.
old and it was analog. And I said that, and I was already into building some modular U-synth synths. I had a banana U-synth modular, and I was like, I can probably fix that. But then 3 years later, every time I tried to sit down and fix it, I started making it worse. So I stopped and sold it off to somebody who really knew how to fix it. So I still sold it at a profit, not quite the profit I would have achieved if I had fixed it.
Sure.
But I had to share some of that profit with the person who eventually fixed it and sold it. But that was a moment also of recognition of my limitations, which is also important. Like you don't want to. It also goes back to the Zen. You don't want to force something that's unnatural. Excessive tenacity can be obsession, and obsession is not always a nice thing. Sometimes it can be, right? It can drive you to achieve surprising results. But then I don't really consider it obsession. I consider it passion. There's a difference.
That's the way that I look at it. Yeah. I was musing on the fact today that I bought my first synthesizer 40 years ago, 4 decades ago, and I have been so passionate about this thing that we do ever since, and I've explored every nook and cranny that I possibly could musically, so many different genres of music, and building things and designing things and working with various manufacturers of these little mom and pop shops who are friends of mine and who I really care about. And it's the thing that I say to people frequently when they want to know about getting having a career in audio. I say you just have to be so passionate that it just drives you continuously, and that's if you're the one who's doing
it becomes
that.
effortless because you're not getting frustrated and mad. You're just enjoying that process.
Absolutely. I consider myself so blessed that I've managed to have a wonderful career in audio for the last 30 years, and it's and it was a matter of just continuing you know, you have to just love it so much
Yeah.
that it drives you constantly, you know.
Yeah, I share that with you. I've also been able to have my career be related to what my passion is. I don't need to have like a day job just to pay the bills,
Sure.
and then to be able to afford my passion. It's all intertwined in some way or another.
Indeed so. So tell me, so tell me about that. You were telling me the other day, you know, that you're a composer, of course, in addition to all of these other things. Tell me a little bit about your earliest exposure to music and how it is that you became a musician, and then I'll share the same story from myself.
Okay. Well, my father was in advertising, and he was always very musical. He had lots of musician friends. He would write. He was a lyricist, so he would have you know, guitar players around him, and they were also into alcohol, so they would get drunk and write songs, and it was their bohemian lifestyle. So my dad he knew a little piano. He always had a piano in the house that he played, always in C major, all white keys.
All white keys.
But he was very, you know, enthusiastic about it, and he was talented. If he had wanted to, he could have developed into an actual more knowledgeable musician. But he was just happy tinkering with the piano and stuff. And my mom always had a really nice voice. She's an actress, and she can sing really well. And some of their friends were some of the greatest musicians in Brazil. Elis Regina and her husband Cesar were friends of the family there. I called them uncle and auntie, you know, until sadly she died when I was still very young. And so there was always a very musical upbringing. I had an aunt who had a great record collection with some Jean-Michel Jarre, which was probably the first synthesizer stuff I've ever heard when I was little. And also Caetano Veloso and some very progressive, interesting, propositive, popular music from Brazil at the time. And I think that probably drove me to naturally develop some musical instinct, to where, like my first little toy keyboards, I would already hear melodies on the radio that I liked and pick them out fairly easily. So I remember a particular moment when my stepmom gave me a remote control car for Christmas that didn't work. So we went back to Toys R Us to exchange it for a working one, and they were out. So they gave us a gift certificate in the same value for anything in the store. And I was walking around this huge Toys R Us in New Jersey, and I saw a Yamaha PSS 480 keyboard.
With the ones with the little speakers
It had
in it, and
little
the small
speakers
keyboards, yeah.
and the small keys, and it had some, I didn't even notice it right when I got it. I just thought that it was really cool musical instrument, and it was in the price range, so we got it. But later I realized that it had a simple FM synthesis engine in there with 5 preset slots.
Really?
So that, must have been 10 at the time. It was like 1985. I was born in 75. So that was literally my introduction to the idea of sound design, of synthesis. And I remember that I made the best sounds. Like my favorite sounds were the ones that I had devised. Like I came up with a pretty, for me at the time, convincing emulation of the Van Halen jump sound, which there wasn't any.
The Oberheim's
exactly.
wave.
There wasn't a preset in the synth that approached it as well as what I had managed to create with those few parameters in there. And that kind of planted the seed. I took that keyboard to Brazil, which was very restrictive with imports. So not a lot of kids my age had a keyboard like that.
Sure.
So I immediately got called to play on bands as a keyboard player for a rock band or something like that.
With your
my
Yamaha
little
keyboard with the
Yamaha,
speakers.
you know. And then I started studying jazz piano. At some point, my teacher said I needed to have something to study with at home. And my father then generously bought me a Yamaha SY22, which had a pretty decent, for the time, Rompler piano sound.
Yeah.
And the action, the key bed was okay. I mean, it wasn't piano, hammer action or anything, but it was good enough for me to like study harmony and scales
Learn
and
the voicings
learn the
of jazz
voicings
and all of that.
yeah. So that was my first like more professional synthesizer. And then I moved to the States when I was 16, which is where my dad lived. I mean, the previous New Jersey story was during vacation. You know,
I
was
see.
living in Brazil, and I would come to the U.S. on vacations, and for Christmas usually. And then I fell in love with the bass guitar. And I dropped keyboards and synthesizers for over a decade.
Wow.
And I focused on playing the electric bass at first, then the upright bass. I went to the University of Miami School of Music for jazz bass.
Wow,
For
you
2
were
years.
very committed.
Yeah, I knew I wanted to be a musician since I was like 12.
Sure.
And I never changed my mind. It was always like, even though my dad tried to convince me to do something else more guaranteed or whatnot, I explained to him, I said, look, I can be a mediocre lawyer, or I can be a genius musician, you know, with a glorious career, which I haven't quite gotten there yet, but it's still a possibility.
Well, I think water finds its own level, and
yeah.
you know, we live in a time in which, because of, you know, things like YouTube, we do have the ability to be able to create a reach and be able to send things out for other people who are interested in the content that we have to generate.
Another
So
facet of the DIY mentality too.
Absolutely so.
You know, I saw, for example, with the DIY channel, I wanted to build kits. As a musician and composer, producer, I wanted to have access to these kinds of instruments. I couldn't afford them. I found out that there was a cottage industry of building them yourself. I realized that I had some of the skill set necessary to make some interesting videos that could be possibly useful to the manufacturers to inform their public. And then I created the channel, the name, the logo, made the first video, and reached out to some makers. That's all very like do it yourself. You know,
Absolutely
you have to take
so.
your own, imagine something, and then materialize it by taking the necessary actual steps to make it happen. And I'm lucky that it actually stuck. And it's not a huge channel, but
but it's a wonderful channel.
Yeah, and it's working in that sense that it's allowed me to have this expensive hobby without out-of-pocket expense, and it also feeds back into my job as a composer.
Right.
Because once I finish, I went from Miami to the University, to New England Conservatory of Music to study contemporary improvisation.
So you finished up, you got a degree in jazz bass?
No, I didn't finish. I transferred in the middle of so after 2 years in Miami, I transferred to the New England Conservatory to finish my studies there in this other department that was much more experimental and open-ended.
Yeah.
And I learned about microtonal music, I learned about free improvisation. And for me, it was much more interesting. I've always been interested in going beyond the accepted and conventional and treaded path of music, and see what other ways there can exist of expressing oneself artistically via sound and music, and which eventually led me to the modular synthesizer. Because at first I was doing those experimental music ideas with traditional instruments, with my bass or with piano, which I then had already started studying again, and drums. I had the luxury of having been taught drums by the great Bob Moses, who's a legendary free jazz and just generally jazz drummer, who's played with Pat Metheny and Jaco Pastorius and all that. So these, in particular, these three, Joe Maneri, who's the microtonalist, Masashi Harada, who was a crazy Japanese free improvisation coach who would also like put on a black leotard and do interpretive dance while we were, I mean, these things were just like mind-blowing for me and super exciting and artistic and interesting. So when I finished that, I had fallen in love with a girl, and we got pregnant and decided to get married. And I realized that I needed to have an occupation that would pay for this budding family's needs. So I visited an old friend of my dad's who was very happy to see me in Brazil, and he had been helped by my father in the beginning of his career, so he helped me hook up with a jingle house, with this commercial music studio in São Paulo. And I was hired immediately as an engineer because they didn't need musicians. They already had a few staff producers, but they heard my demo and they thought that I had a good ear for recording and mixing.
Interesting.
So they said, we're going to hire you as an engineer and we're going to train you for 2 years as a junior engineer so you can be full-fledged Pro Tools engineer in about 2 years. And that happened. I stayed in that company for 7 years.
Wow.
And I consider it better than my college experiences because I really learned with the daily toil of creating commercial music in whatever style the client needed.
Right.
And ego aside, because this is a job that you're a service.
Your job is to be a chameleon.
Yeah, and it really trained me to detach any predispositions and just let myself absorb a new style and learn what the DNA of it is and figure out a way to tick the same boxes without being plagiarism. And that prepared me for the current job that I have. Because after 10 years of doing advertising in Brazil, I decided to move to Mexico. I fell in love with a lady, got married again. I had already separated from my first wife, by the way. And that's when I started my DIY journey, when I moved to Mexico and learned about the existence of DIY synthesizers and felt the need to incorporate those kinds of sounds into my music creation. And then I started building USynth modules in my own format, which was 20 by 8 centimeters with banana plugs. And I started bugging Ray Wilson to help me like debug his own circuits over email. He would get mad at me, but he would help me. And eventually we became pen pals and friends. I produced some of his music for him.
That's great.
And we became pen pals, really, like buddies from a distance. We never really met in person. But that started my DIY journey because I thought I'd get to Mexico, and with my credentials, with having studied in the best schools in the US and 10 years in some top studios in Brazil, that I would come to Mexico and find a job in the industry again.
They would be greeting you with open arms and
that
throwing
didn't
flowers
happen.
at you.
So
as you
I
came
had
up.
a lot of free time, and I was basically teaching kids to play instruments and playing in bars and barely making ends meet, but I had a lot of free time, which allowed me to start exploring, to use it creatively rather than be anxious. I would just use that time in some creative way, which was building synths. And then that's when I started realizing that I could maybe start a YouTube channel about this. And eventually, after I did a movie or two, like documentaries and things, I started getting better work in Mexico. I landed a job writing for the YouTube audio library.
That's great.
And that has continued. So at this point, I have 130 songs available for use royalty-free in the platform. And they pay fairly well. So that's been it's become my day job to compose music for libraries. And eventually I got the same kind of gig with the Facebook sound collection as well. So I'm working mostly for Facebook nowadays, but once in a while YouTube will still order a batch. And that's what's been paying my bills while I develop the channel as sort of a hobby that pays for itself.
Sure.
But it's now also become a bit of a side hustle, a secondary revenue stream, because some manufacturers actually pay me to promote their products or to make video manuals. I don't consider my work really promotion as much as education.
I totally agree.
Like my job is not to like try to sell you a module. It's more try to show you what it does, so that you have that knowledge and you can decide for yourself if that's for you or not. And if it is for you, I can help you maybe understand how to better use it or give you some ideas to push you towards some creative use of these devices. So yeah, I'm an educator. I educate the public about these products on behalf of the manufacturer. Maybe that's just a euphemism for promotion, but that's how I like to think of it.
I don't think so, because I consider myself as doing the exact same thing. Sometimes it's about the gear, but sometimes it's just about trying to find a way to impart the passion about it and the knowledge of how these different things work, right?
Yeah.
If I'm looking to try to figure something out and I can't find any useful information about it on the internet, then that tells me that I should be making some useful information because it'll
Right.
help somebody else.
I
right?
feel so great when somebody like comments below and says, "Wow, I've been really looking for a way to understand what this thing does, and yours is the first video that really makes it clear
Beautiful.
for me." And
Yeah.
I feel like I've helped somebody. So, and that's, I live to serve. I was a waiter for 7 years when I was a college student, and I loved it. You know,
Yeah.
I like the feeling of serving, of taking care of people and making their lives better, making them happier. That to me gives me more pleasure than to receive that myself.
I feel
you
the
know. I
same
like
way.
giving more than receiving
Yeah.
in some way.
It's very interesting. Let me give you my. So that was an amazing, phenomenal story.
Thank you. I was just about to ask
Yeah,
you.
yeah. Let me give you mine. I'll try to be a little bit briefer. But it's interesting to think about the different threads of your life and where they started early on and how that happened, right? So I was thinking about a couple of these threads. So my grandfather was an engineer, and he, fled the war and, was able to emigrate to the United States, to San Francisco, where I'm
Right.
from. And I'll never forget. I was
Which country in Europe are they from?
this is a long story. My family's from Russia, and so my grandmother and my grandfather had to flee Stalin, and they were in Siberia, Novosibirsk, and they had to go through the snow to be able to get across the border into China. They ended up in Shanghai, where my mother was born, and out of the frying pan into the fire, World War II comes. The Japanese come and take over China, and they annex it. And then the moment the Japanese leave, Chiang Kai-shek comes in and makes China communist, and then all of the people who are not Chinese were thrown out. So now we have my grandfather, my grandmother, and my mother, who were utterly stateless, had no papers, had no anything, and then ended up in a refugee camp in the Philippines for years.
Oh my God.
This is a famous story, actually. There was a lot of Russians that this happened to from China.
Right.
And then the United States took them in the 50s, and then they ended up in San Francisco, and, everything went on from there.
Okay.
But the piece of the story that's, really germane here is I'll never forget when I was maybe 8 years old and I was crazy about electronics, and I bought a little Radio Shack transistor radio kit, right? And so it was something where you soldered the pieces together and you made something out of it. So of course I did the world's worst job soldering this kit together. It was horrible. Nothing worked. I couldn't do anything. And then I went, back to my parents' house, and I came back to my grandparents the next weekend, because I would stay with them on the weekends a lot. And of course, my grandfather had completely repaired it and cleaned it up while I was, over the course of the week. And so
So you saw it was possible.
Of course, and it was this beautiful. I mean, it was an act of love, and it was just so wonderful. So that was where sort of the beginnings of my fascination with electronics started.
You reminded me of something I didn't mention, which
Please.
is around similar age as when you had that experience. Mine was a destructive, because what I would do is if something broke, I would open it up to see inside.
See how it worked.
I was always super curious, so I was always a tinker already, even though music was maybe my main interest. But opening up electronic devices and try to figure out how they worked. So, and I also got into soldering some really simple projects then. So, and it was just a brief period, like a year of my life. But then, 20 years later, when I got into DIY, I remembered
Those roots
I
had
have
been set
soldered
there.
before. It's not that difficult, so I can maybe try it again. Sorry, I didn't mean
No,
to.
no,
This was
totally
just a parentheses
agreed.
in the middle of your
I
stuff.
love it as these, as these
Yeah.
ideas trigger other ideas,
Right.
right? So I mean, I consider there to be sort of three, basis of sort of where the direction of my life was. The first, is this electronics thing. The second is that my parents bought a spinet piano when I was 8, and they immediately started me in lessons, me and my father, and I had a great deal of facility. I mean, they could see that I had talent at the instrument,
Nice.
and I studied it, formally, and I did that for quite a while, maybe 6 or 7 years, and then at that point, I was tired of classical. I was tired of being taught by a piano teacher, being told, well, play things just like this, the way that they're on the page. And that was the moment that I started playing the Beatles and Billy Joel and Elton John and all of this stuff. And that was when my world exploded. That was when I realized that I can make my own music on the piano. And these, and I was much more interested in learning how to play Let It Be than, for Elise,
Then an
right?
etude or something.
Right, exactly so. And so that went in a long direction, and I'll sort of pick up that thread in a moment. But the other one that happened right around a little bit later, when I was 13 or so, was that I was able to save up enough money to buy one of the first personal computers that was out there, the Radio Shack TRS-80, which was this thing, and I...
Probably partly designed by our friend Paul Schreiber.
Probably so, and I tore it apart. I mean, I taught myself BASIC, and then I taught myself assembly language programming, not knowing that one thing... I had sold my comic book collection, I remember now, to be able to buy that computer. That was the best return on investment possible.
You just reminded me of another little parenthesis I'll have to open in your story, because I had a similar run-in with computers too. But in my case, it was an Apple IIe when I was about 12 as well. So around the same time that I was tinkering with soldering and starting to play music, I also discovered computers and basic programming and Nibble magazine and copying from the magazine code machine. And I really got super excited about computers, and to the point where I actually thought that I would have a career as a programmer.
Sure.
Right, but that lasted until I created a program that had like 30 pages listing that allowed you to record very simple monophonic melodies using the computer keyboard as a musical keyboard. And that's when I was given the PSS 480. And I just looked at that and compared it with my little program, and I said, no, let me just play the keyboard. So that was the brief glimpse into a possible future in computing, which eventually, after all of my music schooling, when I went to Brazil and got hired at the Jingle House, suddenly I had Pro Tools in front of me, and I was back into using computers. So that's my parenthesis.
No, it's a great parenthesis, and it's true, and it's fascinating how important computers are within the lives of people. Even though I'm sick to death of them and love making music without computers, I wouldn't be even remotely here without them.
No, totally.
So,
and as much as I love my DAWless stuff, the computer is my recorder and my editor and my mixer.
Of course.
So I might not use as many VSTs as other people, but I do use it as the production platform, environment, etc.
From an economic perspective, there is nothing else that could come close to that.
No, or even a power perspective.
Right.
Flexibility.
So in my case, I kept playing the piano all through my teen years. I had saved up. I worked at a toy store, and the Realistic ConcertMate MG1 synthesizer was at the Radio Shack
there. That's a Paul Schreiber hand in there, too.
Indeed. I was talking to him about it last night, and I was playing it in the store and waiting, and it sat there, and one day they dropped its price in half. It was $500, and I was like, I immediately pulled out my checkbook, and I had saved up enough money from my little, from my little high school job to be able to buy it, and I did, and I still have it to this day.
Right, nice.
And that was the beginning of all of that kind of thing. And thinking about YouTube and this stuff, I realized that my friends in high school were all film students. Everyone, we were interested in science fiction, we were interested in writing. I mean, it was all of the, the sort of the more outside creatives rather than the more straight down the middle types of folks. And I can remember now that we used to make a lot of videos with a, with a VHS tape, recorder and a camera, and we were making like sort of fake music videos and things. That's what we would do on a Friday night instead of. So who knew that would turn into this?
Into YouTubing, or whatever.
Whatever. So I continued playing music, but I thought that I was going to be a computer science major, and I went to UC Berkeley as a computer science major, and was miserable almost immediately. And I realized that I had chosen a path because I thought my father wanted me to choose that path. And I was miserable at it. It took all of my love of the computer away, and it just crushed it flat. But at the same time, I started playing in bands. And all of a sudden, I went from playing the piano to playing synthesizers. I got a Roland JX3P, and
did you have the PG200?
I never did.
No,
I never did.
I got one with one of those.
Lucky
much
you.
later in life, though.
Much later.
Like when it was already vintage.
So I got one and a Fender Rhodes, and I was playing in bars long before I was old enough to drink in them. And I realized that I had made a mistake, and that the computer science major was not the right major for me. And so I immediately turned around and started the music major instead at Berkeley. And it was too late for me to be able to do it all the way through, but I took every class
At
I
Berkeley
possibly
School of
could.
Music or
No,
Berkeley,
at
California?
University of California,
Right.
Berkeley.
Okay.
So I'm from the from
Right.
the West Coast. So I did that. And was playing in bands, and I was the musical director of a progressive rock band that that was a wonderful thing and that people liked, and we ended up getting a record contract when I was 23.
What was the name of this band?
It was called Episode.
Episode, cool.
And I mean, of course it never went anywhere, but it was delightful, and people
But
who
that's
were,
a fairly high level, though.
Yeah.
If there's a musical director and following, I never actually had that with any of my bands.
it was we did it because we were young enough and we didn't have enough other things that we had to do, and so we worked very hard at it. But the point of that story was that I had already bought whatever gear I could to record the bands that I was in, and now we were in the situation where this small record label actually expected us to make them a record, and that was the point when I bought a 1/4-inch 4-track and a nicer mixer and MIDI verbs and
became a
quadriverbs
producer.
and all of that stuff, and then recorded the band and produced it, and who knew? And it was just something that we managed to do as we were going along and figuring it out. But we put the time and the energy into it to try to be able to make something that was nice and something that I was proud of. Even if I listen back to it all these years later, I think it's quaint. But I was like, wow, there was definitely some there.
Yeah,
all the way
and
back.
everything is relative to its context. So
Yeah.
you can't evaluate it just like, out of context now. You have to think about what was happening
What was
then,
happening then.
yeah, and where you were at, what your skill set was, what your interests were. That's cool.
So
That's
I'm
a
gonna.
cool story.
So I'll go through the quick. I'll go through the quick, short rest of it, which was, I graduated Berkeley, was doing computer programming to make myself a living, just like you were as a waiter, and I was utterly miserable. And I immediately went back to school and got a second bachelor's degree, this time in electronic music, and studied at San Francisco State University, where they had one of the early Buchla 100s, and they had a big Serge system, and I just
So you
fell in
actually
love
have
with it.
a long academic history of interaction with these things.
And I did it, and that was when my life completely opened up, and I was exposed to musique concrète, and Pierre Schaeffer, and Pierre Henry, and Stockhausen, and all of this. And
my parallel for that was the NEC, the New England Conservatory.
right, same thing, where all of a
It's
sudden you
cool.
were exposed to ideas that you didn't even know existed.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I remember I used to go to Joe Maneri's performance techniques class, which was just a class where anybody from if classical, jazz, third stream, it didn't matter, or even the instrument would just come and perform for him. And he was this older man with so much experience and insight that he would just listen, observe, and critique, and say like, oh, you should. Whatever he thought that could be improved upon is that performance. And I wasn't enrolled in the class. I had heard about it because it was legendary, and I was just sitting in the back, like pretending I was part of the class. And I remember one day I mustered the courage to go up to him at the end and say, Joe, would you mind listening to me play the piano for you? And I played a kind of free improvisation that I had been doing since I was really little. Like when I was little, I'd go to my grandparents' house, they had a piano, I would step on that sustain pedal and just sort of listen to notes, unrelated notes, how they would interact and feed into each other, and just loved that sound, that resonance. And he heard me and said, wow, you must listen to a lot of Schoenberg. And I said, who's that? And he said, you don't know Schoenberg? You sound like you're trying to be Schoenberg. Go listen to this. And he gave me a bunch of album titles to go to the record library of the school and listen to. And when I heard Schoenberg, I was like, oh my God, this is the aesthetic I've been intuitively trying to
How
achieve.
incredible. Were you actually trying to do serialism, where you were not playing a note until...
I was trying to avoid tonality. And I would intuitively, once I played one or two notes, the third one would already be like veering off of the established tonality, which is how you build the tone roll. So yeah, I'm sure I had heard some Schoenberg without knowing at some point, and had it like subconsciously influencing my direction. I'm not claiming to have like to be like a natural Schoenberg.
No, but clearly
But-
there was something in either
But there
in
was
your
a desire
ear or
to avoid the cliche, the standard, the diatonic sounds, to search for something beyond them, which led me towards a very atonal kind of improvisational style.
Interesting.
Which eventually led to microtonal exploration as well, which is going beyond even atonality, actually finding different tuning systems that some might belong to other cultures, some might not
Japanese
belong to any
gamelan, something like that.
yeah,
for
or
example.
Indian raga music
Sure.
or whatnot, but also mathematically derived scales that don't even belong to any previous culture. More like trying to develop new futuristic ways to think of tonal organization and so on. That for me was a very important moment when and Joe recognized in me the potential to be a composer, and he wanted me to train in the classical composers first.
Sure.
And I was too lazy to do that. I was smoking pot and playing bass in funk bands and
Musicians that smoke
Yeah.
pot, I don't know what you're talking about. I've never heard of that before.
yeah, and you know, college. I had long hair, nipple
Yeah.
piercings, and so I was kind of a crazy hippie, and being rebellious with my dad and my grandpa and things like
Like
that.
you
I think
do.
it was just a phase, but yeah, I was definitely like looking for something beyond. I was more interested in like punk rock and free jazz than anything like studying Mozart or Bach. Even though now I have an unbelievable admiration of Bach in particular.
Yep.
At the time, I thought everything sounded like too normal and
Very
diatonic
trite,
and
very
trite.
ricky-ticky.
Yeah, and I just wanted the opposite of that. And these guys, Joe Maneri, Bob Moses, and Masashi Harada, they were like my mentors. And all three of them really took me under their wing. They would take me to their house,
Nice.
like feed me meals, take me as their roadie to recording sessions. So I had a relationship with them beyond just the school setting, and they were like my three Mr. Miyagis. You know? I was like, having that kind of guidance and apprenticeship relationship is really beautiful. I really hope for most people who want to get into something like this that they find their own mentors.
Yeah.
It's super important.
Well, and if you think about it, I mean, you know, you are now at the age and you are now at the experience level in which you're giving back, as am I. We're paying back those mentors that we had by trying to help other people, by trying to encourage
in
and
a
inspire
little bit
other
different
people.
way, which lacks a little in the directness of
course.
being face to face with somebody. But yeah, we're definitely
But
at
it
least
is,
trying
you
to
know,
share what we have learned, you know, with as many people as we can.
So I'll finish briefly sort of the educational part
Sure.
of my world just to be able to get through this. And I've never spoken about any of this stuff on the channel at all.
Oh, I'm
so
glad
if
we're
anyone's,
having an
if
opportunity to hear
anyone's
about it,
actually
yeah.
still listening, hopefully, you know, they'll hear. So my entire world
Stay
opened
tuned
up.
to the end of the video for the surprising twist.
The giveaway. So I finished my bachelor's degree in electronic music, and my entire conception of music and sound was just wide open. I mean, it was just split wide open. Went back out into the world to make a living a little bit, was miserable, and realized that I wasn't finished with my education yet. And being in the Bay Area, I went for it and went to Mills College in Oakland, the San Francisco Tape Music Center, and got a master's degree in electronic. I studied under, the people there, I studied under Maggie Payne and Chris Brown and John Bischoff. Alvin Curran. My most important teacher was Pauline Oliveros. And
Oh wow, you actually studied
I
under
did.
Pauline
I
Oliveros.
studied with Pauline.
What an honor.
It was. I went to these
You're
deep-
legit. You're
Well, I don't know about
absolutely
that. I learned
legit.
from
He's
one of the.
legit. He's too humble. but
I miss Pauline. She was a lovely, lovely.
I can only
lovely human
imagine
being.
by knowing her music, I can
Yeah.
sort of sense her personality.
It was incredible, and she was there. And at the same time, this is the Bay Area. There was this gorgeous concert hall they had there. People were making experimental and avant-garde concerts all the time. And guess who would show up in the audience? Don Buchla.
Oh, wow.
He was there constantly.
Cool.
You know, this sort of hippie in a cowboy hat who would be there just to listen to the music.
Around
and
what
perform
time
it.
was this?
Let's see. This would have been about the mid-'90s. I think that I went to graduate school around 1997, 1998.
Yeah, I was at
something like
NEC
that.
at that
At that same time. So it was incredible. It opened me up, and I made, you know, an awful lot of that kind of music. And then here was the real kicker. While I was there, I taught myself Pro Tools in order to be able to use it for a, you know, a complex experimental piece of music that I wanted to do.
Sure.
And of course, I had my ear opened to this notion of sound is music, right? I mean, John Cage says music is organized sound.
Yeah,
and I completely
think that's
agree
the
with
best definition.
that. I think so too.
Most inclusive.
So here's how that story ended, and this is how I finally made it. You know, I was 30, I think, and I'd been sad because I'd been making my living doing computer programming to put myself through music school and so forth. I got to the end of graduate school and said, what am I going to do now? And just as I finished, it must have been within a couple of weeks of my getting my degree and finishing my thesis. I'm from Marin County, which is just north of San Francisco, just over the Golden Gate Bridge.
Okay.
And friends of mine who worked at LucasArts Entertainment Company called me and said, we need a sound designer for our new video game. Would you like to come audition for it?
Oh, wow.
So, you know, when I tell this story, it's one of these things where
That
luck
would be
comes
your
to the prepared
equivalent to
mind.
my working in advertising.
Yes, indeed. Well, indeed.
It's something that's still within what you love to do, but it's actually an industry that pays well. And
it was how I made my living. I've made my living as a sound designer for many years. And I'll get to the end of that story, and I'll go very quickly here. But so I got into LucasArts. I passed the audition because I had taught myself Pro Tools, and I was so focused on this stuff. I aced it. I got the gig. It was for a three-dimensional adventure game called Grim Fandango that you know turned out to be sort of a critical favorite. This is about 1998
I've heard
or
of
so.
that.
It was a long time ago. So I did that, but because of the fact, so that gig came to an end, but because I already knew computer programming and music, they kept me on so that I could do all the music programming with the composer for the video game, all of which was, you know, there were no nice tools to do things at that point. And then one thing led to another, and being at Lucas, of course, I started working on Star Wars. And so I have been on and off working on Star Wars content from 1998 till now.
Oh, wow.
I
I didn't know that.
No.
So have you done stuff for the new, like The Mandalorian and these new series?
What I do now, so to cut to the end of the story, my day job is that I'm the audio director of Disney Publishing Worldwide.
Oh my God.
So, you know, I have
That's
a team.
a cool job.
It is a cool job. I have a team of
Congratulations.
10 people, you know, sound designers and composers and dialogue people. Unfortunately, I have much less, the downside of becoming a manager or a director
is that you're
is
not longer directly doing the creative stuff.
I'm doing much less audio production than I used to, but I did sound design continuously, you know, from 1998 until 2012.
But now you manage a
or so.
team.
And now I manage a team.
Because you have the know-how to evaluate and direct their work.
Exactly. And there is one piece of the creative puzzle that I still keep for myself. We make a lot of audiobooks. And so I am the guy that directs all of the Star Wars audiobooks.
Wow.
So I go through
cool.
and, you know, I will read the story and I will spot it for sound effects because you know, if they're Star Wars audiobooks, they need to have music and sound effects all the way through.
There's got
It
to
can't
be,
just be
you know, R2D2.
all of that.
And lightsabers.
Lightsabers and blasters and new versions of those. Literally, a month ago, I was finishing up, I was preparing for a book that had an astromech in it, you know, which is the type of droid that R2 is.
Yeah.
And I didn't want to use the R2 sounds, so I went back and studied, you know, how Ben had done it, how Ben Burt had done it, and it was with an ARP 2600. So I had an ARP Odyssey, and I followed, you know, sort of the same approaches, and I'll be darned if it didn't sound like another astromech from the same universe.
Wow,
and so we've used
awesome.
that stuff. So I was at LucasArts Entertainment for quite a while working on Star Wars video games, and then I moved over to Skywalker Sound. And so I got to work at Skywalker Sound doing audio for video games. I directed Lego Star Wars while I was there and Star Wars
I had no idea
Battlefront.
about any of this.
Well,
I'm
I
such a
didn't, you know.
huge fan of Lucas Sound. like I've seen documentaries, read interviews with some of the people who've worked there. In particular, that movie WALL-E.
WALL-E, yeah.
That has some of the best sound design. Were you involved in any
I
way with
wasn't
that
involved
movie?
in film. I've done sound for film, but I didn't do any of that really through Skywalker Sound. I was doing the interactive stuff.
Okay.
Ben Burt used the Kima extensively to be able to do all that voice processing stuff for WALL-E.
The
which
capybara.
Yeah, it's another long conversation for another time.
Okay.
But that was amazing. Eventually, I left to be able to have a little bit more stable healthcare and stuff for my kids, and I moved over to Activision and became an audio director of a studio there, where, among other things, it was just as Guitar Hero was getting started. So with my musical background, I was able to really push it, and then ended up turning our game studio into another Guitar Hero studio to be able to be specific on that kind of stuff. And then I
So you're
became
involved with Guitar Hero development.
I was the audio director of Guitar Hero Van
Oh
Halen.
my God, you're a legend.
Whatever.
Oh, you're not famous.
I've had a great career, and it was really
You
neat
sure have.
because I got to work with Eddie and Alex Van Halen,
Oh
and I
my
got to
God.
remix all of their music for it. It was an incredible honor and incredible pressure, when you have Eddie Van Halen evaluating what his guitar sounds like, and
Yeah, in a game.
So anyway, sort of end the story very, very quickly. None of this is quick. I finished that up. The company eventually folded. I went back to doing freelance game audio production, both music and sound design. And after I had done a project for Sesame Street that was one of the earliest iPad projects, it was a big hit. And the people that had done that at Sesame Street moved over to Disney. And they were at Disney Publishing, and they quickly realized they actually needed an audio team of people who knew interactivity and who were going to be able to be subject matter experts in this. So they called me and said, would you like to come and start an audio department at the Walt Disney Company? I said, absolutely. And so that was that. And
It's a dream gig.
it's been, I don't like living in LA, but the rest of it I love. And I've been there for 10 years now.
It's a little too hot.
I'm more of a suburb kind of guy than a city kind of guy.
Yeah, me too.
So anyway, all of that was a very, very long story. And between all of those things, I was playing in bands, I was making records, and I was doing all of the stuff that you do to be able to try to have a vibrant artistic life while at the same time, doing something within the arts that allow you to be able to make a living.
It's interesting how many parallels between our two stories.
Fascinating. It's fascinating.
That's so cool.
Well, it's great. We're just getting to know each other, and it's a beautiful story. And I mean, all of that is not. I don't think in either of our cases we're not trying to say to the people who are watching this, look how great we are, how wonderful. It's about look what passion can do for you.
Yeah, and it might, if it empowers one person to believe in their vision and enough to actually take the leap and take the risks involved and accept that the sacrifices, that it can pay off.
Absolutely.
Like I know I'm super happy with my career right now, and I can see that you are as well.
Of course I am.
And I know that it's not always possible for everybody, but it's good to see that it is that it can be.
I think the way that I look at it is you need to be flexible as to what you want to do. If you love audio so much that you have to be involved in the audio arts,
be open to any kind of possibility.
It could be.
Because you never know where life's going to blow you.
No, and it could be that, I wanted to be a composer, but I ended up doing audiobooks. Or I wanted to be a composer and I ended up being a sound designer.
I wanted to be
a
a bass player for a famous band and ended up writing music for media libraries.
And still being able to play funk bass when you want to.
And I still get to play funk bass, exactly. So,
which is absolutely wonderful.
I think that's key, and going back to the Zen meditation aspect of things, of not going against the grain or the flow.
Right.
Because if you fight against reality, you will only lose about 100% of the time. You have to recognize when life is trying to show you, because there's another saying that I like from the Zen Buddhists, which is life has much better plans for you than you can make yourself.
I love that.
So you have to be open to that. I remember when I was freaking out at the end of my University of Miami 2 years, when I was leaving to go to Boston. I was still like a little uneasy and unsure about my decisions, and I talked to the head of the bass department, Don Kaufman, who had been a friend of Jaco Pastorius's. He was a very experienced man, and he was a very nice guy. And I said to him, I don't know if I want to be a session musician, if I want to be a jazz bass player, if I want to be a funk bass player. I was still limiting my choices within the bass performing thing.
This was your circle that you were trying to be able to.
But I was voicing a concern that I wasn't sure where to prop up my ladder before climbing up the wall. And he just told me, he said, just relax. You're a talented kid, you're gonna find your way. Like, life's gonna find a way to show you your directions, and just be open to them and accept opportunities and try to be as prepared as you can for those opportunities. And so the more that you learn and practice and devote yourself to your passion, the more prepared you will be for when and if an opportunity arises.
Right.
You can not only take advantage of it, but thrive in it. Right. So that you can actually like build and grow into this new avenue that might have opened, instead of just like have a brief encounter with it.
I agree. My favorite saying, to follow up on just what you said, is luck comes to the prepared mind. And what I mean by that is, all of us, as we're going down the road of life,
preparation.
Indeed, so. There are all these off-ramps that we can take from the freeway that will lead us to diverging and going into different aspects of our lives or our careers. But the only way that you can get from here to the off-ramp that you want to is by having done all of the work necessary, both on yourself as a person and within whatever the skill set is, to be able to be ready so that when that opportunity presents itself, you're ready to be able to take it. And the people that you're working with are ready to say, yes, please come on in and do this.
I think we're in total agreement. Awesome.
That's a lovely, lovely thing. Well, this has been an incredible conversation, and not at all what I thought it was going to be. I think we should probably talk about DIY synth stuff a little bit.
Well, maybe next time. I think it would be off color, off the tone of what we've established so far. I think this is what this video should.
We will
be.
leave this. We will leave this as it is.
And we can later Zoom together and talk about
Indeed
specific DIY ideas and things. But I think this was more important, actually.
I love it.
This is underlying everything else, is what the things that we've talked about today.
Well, what I would say then, to wrap this up, is what a wonderful thing that I came to Knobcon 2022 and made a new friend.
I have to say the same.
So, Quincas Moreira, thank you so much. What a pleasure to meet you, and what a pleasure to talk to you.
The pleasure's been all mine.
So, well, I guess then we will wrap it up there. If you're still here with us, thank you for listening. I hope that you enjoyed the conversation, and next video will be about, synthesizers or something like that, perhaps. So for DIY Synth Guy and for Nick at Under the Big Tree, this is Nick, signing off.